Dr. Slaughter's general approach here and the Govian approach is the fact that pollution itself is highly distortionary. The inability to internalize those costs has led to grotesque misallocations of resources with enormous path dependency problems that are best exhibited in the obvious cases of transportation. Some historic decisions, some profound corruptions, and some very bad strategy and the lack of a public interest. The whole set of misvaluations is further complicated by running the entire set of comparative costs not only on the basis of the distribution of resources now, which determines efficiency in the technical sense, the old Edgeworth-Bowley observation about the inability, as Norgard and Howard pointed out, the inability to transfer an efficiency judgment from one distribution of resources to another versus the need to effectively change those efficiencies. What else can we do but start with a massive pricing structure that changes that distribution of resources? We need to reorganize the equilibrium because with the strongly positive discount rate we are applying now, as Professor Khan pointed out, hugely beneficial long-term outcomes may be quite effectively prevented. So the short of this, I think, is that there's an overwhelmingly irrefutable case, in effect, for the massive intervention of some sort of a global restructuring to correct some of these huge distortions. And the big step that Dr. Slaughter is offering is not quite unilateral, but not universal progress. The need to proceed getting past the China won't do it, so we shouldn't either excuse. I think we see a way past that now. So I'd like to thank you both and support this as much as I can.
Well, thank you. May I just offer some further thoughts on this? I actually did a model, and I'm familiar with Norgard's work. He's really an excellent economist, a very thoughtful person. And it is true, I mean, in the usual Edgeworth-Bowley box diagram, which is basically our Pareto optimality, you do not get from efficiency to equity so easily. And the efficiency that we are talking about when you're not taking these external costs into account is not really efficient. And as I argued, it's also not equitable. The issue of multiple equilibria here actually is important. And what I have been able to show is that if you have multiple equilibria, it's very easy to get stuck in the wrong equilibrium. And once you're stuck in the wrong equilibrium through path dependency, it's very difficult to get out of that wrong equilibrium without massive, policy shifts. So I agree with you completely.
Yeah, I mean, that's an extremely important point. But it's one that needs to, I think, be separately addressed. And I would like to see the entire economic development community begin to focus on institutional questions within countries instead of on capital shortages and et cetera. Speaking from one Central Asian country that I spent a lot of time in, just as examples of pricing, our landlady in Jalalabad would get very concerned about our leaving the electric furnace on, and she'd come around at 6 o'clock every morning and turn the thing off, and we'd have to go turn it back on again because the house had no insulation and it had a hard time keeping 60 degrees in the house when it was 45 degrees outdoors. But she paid that bill at, I think, something like 6 mils a kilowatt. She paid that bill every month. Natural gas, on the other hand, the meter only had 3 digits in it. It always turned over. She didn't care how much gas you use. And the stories about people in workshops would keep burners on the stove all day long because matches cost money and the stove is free to them. So I mean, the behavior is totally rational, but it's a function of the institutions that they're trapped in and the path dependencies that they have. Telephones. Landlines were $1 a month, but they didn't work very well. So everyone who could afford it had a mobile phone at world prices. You know, $7 a minute for a call, for an international call. You put down $100 deposit and you get charged at X cents, something like 50 cents a minute until it's used up and your phone gets shut off. That means the pricing, but you find that things that are traded globally and that are imported into the economy are priced at world levels. And you wind up with sort of dual economies in every country. But it's a matter of the fact, and I don't want to go very far into this, that in so many underdeveloped countries, they're trapped into an institutionalist set, and for Central Asia, this comes a lot from the Soviet Union, in which the only way to make a living beyond subsistence is to be a gatekeeper. That is, you have to have a position or access to something that enables you to demand a payment from someone else for your services, and your services such as admission to an exam or admission to a class or a grade or treatment in a physician's office are something that they really need to have, so that you can charge rents for that. To me, it is very much an institutional problem, but I see that as a problem that has to, in terms of its solution, has to be addressed side by side with climate, rather than having the climate policy diluted because of the difficulty of addressing the institutional problem.
That's where the elegance of being able to redistribute the revenues is a very positive feature of that nature. You can separate these things. You can have a straightforward mechanism.
It's also It's also possibly the most difficult part of the problem, because a global carbon tax would generate a huge amount of money.
But
and you have an enormous political fight over how to distribute that.
But that's always the problem.
Yeah, it's legitimate, I think, and it will, I think, probably advance global governance. I am for Tobin tax also, and it will pose similar issues. And I think while Tobin tax may be a little easier to implement, contrary to what self-interested parties might say, this tax is feasible, this global tax. And I think we will have the incentives to create the kind of institutions globally and regionally that will be necessary to do this. And people have to discuss issues of equity and transfer. Every time you have a transfer issue, people will actually disagree and present their case, and the ultimate solution will be a kind of political solution. And that's perfectly legitimate as long as dissemination of information is honest and open, there is debate, a democratic procedure to make decision and to revisit and monitor. But these are problems that we have to solve in social life.
You were talking, and I would agree at the beginning, about this is an extremely important issue, and it's the issue today. It's not about tomorrow. And so you're talking also about a time frame. This is a very complex issue in terms of implementing the policy to institute these changes that I think are very, very good. What is your forecast in terms of time to get this through? Because that's an issue. I don't think we have.
I guess my forecast is that the time frame required is far shorter if the United States, together with Europe and the Japanese and some other governments in the world, are willing to take leadership, strong leadership on the issue, than if we attempt to have universal consensus on a new regime. I mean, the time frame for the new regime doesn't even, presumably in place by 2012. I don't think that's going to happen. And if it does happen, it's going to be a very watered down regime. I don't want, you know, I'm not very sanguine about it, but I think that you're going to have leadership. It's going to have to be constructive. It's going to have to involve a whole lot of transparency and willingness to build. You know, you don't just tax everyone and not resolve the problems that that's going to create. And as Professor Khan pointed out, you're going to have distortions, at least in distortions from the standpoint of the way the current distribution works. That would change. But in fact, it has to change. Don?
To follow up on the discussion, almost all economists I read agree with you that a carbon tax is superior in almost all ways in cap and trade. The European community is already in cap and trade. If I follow the political winds in the U.S., it's going to go to cap and trade. Will the fact that the industrialized world is in cap and trade, isn't that going to make it much more difficult to move to a more efficient system that we talk about here in the carbon tax?
Do you want to talk to that?
Well, I think it's a difficult question of political economy, to the extent that EU and others may already be committed to this alternative. Yes, it will be difficult to make the constituency that they have, and I'm not talking about a larger constituency, but really the elite policymaking community. But we have to remember that it is possible, to persuade people through arguments, because policymakers are actually, surprising as it might sound, are becoming better trained, partly thanks to educators in graduate schools around the world. Secondly, new generations of policymakers also come into being. But again, there is a question of time, and that I cannot be too sanguine about.
I'm not sure that the two have to be mutually exclusive, at least in the beginning. I think that it should be possible to initiate a tax regime in the context of an existing cap and trade regime, partly which I would expect that the tax regime would over time replace the cap and trade. Because I think there are so many holes in attempts to cap emissions, especially if you're doing it on the basis of a national baseline. So many problems with the trading system that no matter how many times we fix the problems of the existing system, there are going to be new ones. That there will be a learning curve on the part of policymakers. And this may take 10, 15 years. But I think there will be a learning curve whereby people come to understand that the tax system is in fact not only more efficient, but also far less costly to administer, and possibly more acceptable to their constituencies. There's some, optimism in that. But well, if we don't have any more questions, I want to thank Professor Haider for agreeing to serve as discussant on this, so that it wasn't just me and the audience. You've added an enormous amount to this discussion, and thank the audience for the questions, the softball questions in particular. And with that, I bring this session to a close.